Thank you so much. And can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm going to give a few disclaimers before we move into a short period of meditation. First of all, I am somebody who struggles with anxiety. And one of the ways that I deal with that is I close my eyes when I speak. If that bothers you, I am sorry. But I'm not going to open my eyes for you. So I just ask for your forbearance with that. I also, especially when the Spirit takes hold and I just kind of start doing my thing, which may or may not happen, we'll see how the next hour goes, I sometimes forget that you all are even out there. My eyes are closed and I'm just in there grooving with the Spirit within, and I get softer and softer and softer. So when that happens, I'm going to ask Betty to come up and whack me a little. Or maybe more gently, because I'm a real strong believer that part of the spiritual journey is unlearning aggression. So maybe you can gently tap me or something like that. But also, at any time, if anyone in the back has difficulty hearing me, please, make a face, stick your tongue out, do this, and I will try to be mindful, unless my eyes are closed, and then it's Betty's job. So thank you for your presence. This is my first visit to the Theosophical Society, although I have certainly been familiar with Leadbeater and Annie Besant. Am I pronouncing it properly? Besant. Okay, see, I'm learning. And Madame Blavatsky for many, many years, and am deeply respectful for the amazing work that this community and its founders has done over the years. So it's just a joy and a privilege to be here. And I will tell you, and I've only been here since about 8 o'clock last night, so the last, 15 hours, I have been party to some wonderful conversation. I've already texted my wife and said, oh, I wish you were here, because she would truly love this community as well. So it is such a delight to be here. Thank you for your presence, for all of you, every one of you. What I would like to do, I am here representing the Christian tradition. So I think the first thing I want to do is apologize. And yes, that we can all smile with that, but there's some heartfelt reality there. I was sharing with Rabbi Rami a few minutes ago that when I look at the Christian tradition or the Christian religion, and for me, it's funny, we were talking about this last night. For me, religion is not the dirty word, institution is the dirty word. That I see religion as simply spirituality manifested in community. And I think this is an example that can be healthy. But we all know that it also can all too easily be institutionalized. And when it is institutionalized, it can go off the rails. My actual faith membership is Roman Catholic, and that's the mothership of toxic institutions. And yes, if my bishop is watching this on YouTube, I mean that. It really is. And so it's, and I'm sorry if that offends people, but I think we have to tell the truth. I do think there are many amazing Catholics who are doing amazing work. The teachings still matter. And so that is certainly something that I think many of us need to do. So I apologize. Again, Rami, I could pay you. I'm not going to, but I could pay you, because the fact that he ended with that beautiful affirmation that what matters is the mystical heart. What matters is the mystical heart. And that's really what I hope we can do over the next hour together, is to celebrate, to savor the mystical heart of Christianity as truly as one with the mystical heart of all the wisdom traditions. So to kind of set the stage, I want to just read from a Buddhist writer. Many of you may be familiar with him. His name is Adyashanti, and he has written a book called Resurrecting Jesus. And so he wrote that, and I just read this on the plane last night, and I was just like, well, that's going into the talk tomorrow. So and Adyashanti, I think, was raised in a secular home, then became a student of Zen, and became authorized to teach Zen. If I've got my, I'm sure you've met him. I've never met him, but and I think now he's, like so many of us, he's bigger than just Zen, but he realizes that he thinks Jesus is pretty cool. So he wrote this book called Resurrecting Jesus, and he says, one of the reasons I think it's so powerful to renew our understanding of the Jesus story is because it's the foundational story of Western culture. And it dominates so much of our lives, even if we don't think of ourselves as Christian at all. There are beautiful things about the Christian message, about Jesus' message, and about the presence that Jesus represents. But often it doesn't come through in the churches we attend. You don't say. Jesus' message was about intimate, personal, immediate access to divine being, to the kingdom of heaven within, or in the interest of non-gendered language, the reign of heaven within. That's what Jesus preached. For Jesus, there was no intermediary. No priest was necessary to connect you with the mystery. Only an open heart and an open mind. This viewpoint got him in a lot of trouble with the religious authorities of his time. You alluded to that earlier. Because power structures almost always claim to be the necessary intermediary between you and the divine. In Jesus' time, just as today, many religious institutions fail to fulfill their primary directive, which is to connect us with our spiritual nature. Now, I could spend the next hour just deconstructing why Christianity got so messed up. I almost used a word that rhymes with truck, but this seems to be an elegant crowd, so I'll try to keep my language a little elevated here. But and we could say Christianity got in bed with the Roman Empire. We can say that there were some socio-political things that went on that maybe was necessary for the fledgling community's survival in the 3rd century, but we're still paying a high price for it today. But again, I'm not here to talk about the religion, so we're just going to bracket that and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you've ever been traumatized by the Christian religion. You are not alone. I have been traumatized by the Christian religion. And I think the Christian religion is a religion about trauma. The crucifixion was a trauma. It was a trauma in the memory of that community of people. And so one of the things that we need to do, and here I am so inspired by the community of color in the United States and the bold and courageous work that men and women and persons of color are doing in response to the trauma of slavery. And of course, I cannot even begin to understand what that looks like. But I'm Scottish. My ancestors were forced off the land in 1843. Some of you may be Irish and had ancestors at the potato famine. I mean, many of us carry trauma. The Jewish community, heaven knows, with the Shoah, carries trauma. And so what is tragic about Christianity is how the trauma of the crucifixion became like a virus that replicated itself. And what I think the promise of mystical Christianity is to see the trauma of the crucifixion not as something to become a religious fetish, but as something that can become a gateway to healing. And so I would invite you that when you see a crucifix, or hear songs like "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" or anything like that, especially if it triggers you, to then go within and say, is this an invitation for me to take my healing a little bit deeper? Again, for the interest of not only my ecstatically, blissfully beautiful life, but also that I may be available to serve others. So I am already breaking my agreement with the Theosophical Society. I was asked to begin with a meditation. So I'm going to invite us, better late than never, I'm going to invite us into a meditation now. And to lead us into that, I want to share with you a quotation that I saw. One of the organizations that trained me in contemplative practice was an organization based in Washington, D.C. called the Shalem Institute. Some of you may be familiar with Shalem. It was founded by an Episcopal priest named Tilden Edwards, who went on sabbatical in 1973. This is their 50th anniversary year. Went on sabbatical in 1973, went to spend 2 weeks in a Buddhist monastery out California, ended up staying there for 2 months, and at the end of 2 months went to the Roshi and said, I'm gonna quit the Episcopal Church. I'm getting out of that racket, and I just want to be your student. And the Roshi said, oh no, you're not my student, you're my brother priest. Your job is to go back and to help Christianity reclaim what has been lost. And so Tilden did that, and he returned to D.C. He's retired now, of course. Returned to D.C. and started the Shalem Institute, its mission is to reclaim the treasures of contemplative and mystical Christianity, which have so much been lost. But the 20th century is an amazing time. You mentioned Keating. We could add Merton. We could add Evelyn Underhill, Teilhard de Chardin, Simone Weil, Howard Thurman, living people like Richard Rohr and Cynthia Bourgeois, and many, many others who are doing this amazing work. So part of my apprenticeship was with Tilden's organization, the Shalem Institute. I did my graduate studies at a university in Northern Virginia, George Mason University, and so I used to go into D.C. to sit with the mystical Christians. And I was in their library one day, and they had a print up, and I can't even tell you who did the print, and of course this was 40 years ago now. And but the inscription in the print, and it was just attributed Quaker saying. And friends, I have searched and searched and searched for this. I have never, ever found it since. So maybe the mushrooms on my omelet were really the happy mushrooms. I don't know. But the saying was this: you should speak only when your words are an improvement upon silence. You should speak only. Doesn't that put you and me in trouble? You should speak only when your words are an improvement on silence. And so obviously I am disobeying that right now. But I can tell you that I hold that in my heart. And of course, as a writer, writing is just speaking at a very low level. It's speaking with my fingers instead of with my lips. So even as I write, if I'm writing my blog or I'm working on a book, that haunts me in a good sense of the word. That are these words, if they're not an improvement on silence, are they at least a good friend to silence? Maybe that's what most of us mere mortals can hope for, is that our words can be a good friend to silence. So Rami mentioned Thomas Keating. And what I want to do is just, for those of you who may not be familiar with Thomas, he just died about 5 years ago. He was a Trappist monk, the same kind of monk that Thomas Merton was, and who I have studied with and I'm affiliated with. And he and a couple of his colleagues, back in the 1970s, if you think about, again, the early 70s when Tilden was off thinking he was going to become a Buddhist, it was the age of, Ram Dass going to India and meeting Maharaji what the Theosophists were doing 100 years earlier, the rest of America was catching up in the 1970s. It was a time of incredible discovery. And so for the Trappists, what they discovered was that every now and then a young person would knock on their door, and they'd answer the door, and they're like, a young person wants to come to a retreat. And the young person would say, I'm looking for the ashram. Can you tell me where the ashram is? Or I'm looking for the zendo. I heard there's a zendo up the street. And after a while, the monks sat down and they said, well, we have nothing against zendos and ashrams, but what about what we've got? And what they realized is that, again, there is this lineage of wisdom within Christianity that has essentially been forgotten. And so there's one book in particular, it's called The Cloud of Unknowing. You may have it at the bookshop. And it's very explicit instructions into meditation. And so they basically took that and they kind of boiled it down into kind of like 4 simple steps. And they began teaching this, and they call this centering prayer. And the name comes from Thomas Merton, again, the Trappist monk who died in the 60s, who was a 5-star mystic, who said that the purpose of prayer is to be one with God in the center of our hearts. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's essentially what Merton said. So this idea of the center of our hearts is where prayer happens. And so this idea of centering prayer. So I'm going to give you the instructions, but before I give you the instructions, let me share with you something that continually frustrates me as a person who tries to teach contemplative prayer to Christian audiences and a Christian readership online. There is a certain segment of Christianity that is afraid of meditation. They have been lied to. They have been given really bad interpretation of one of Jesus's parables. Jesus tells this parable of if you have a devil in the house and the devil leaves the house and you sweep the house clean, but then you leave the house empty, and the devil will go and find 7 other spirits even worse than him, and they'll come back, and finding the house empty, they will enter it. This is a story about justice and about how we treat one another and how we care for one another. But it gets misinterpreted that, and here's the line, and you can Google this online, except don't, but you could. If you empty your mind, the devil will enter. Christians, a certain segment of Christians, believe this is what Jesus taught. And it is absolutely maddening. And then to make matters worse, they'll look at something like centering prayer and they'll say, well, that's just transcendental meditation, or that's just zazen, or that's just shamatha or vipassana, which is all just different ways of saying, well, that's just meditation. But without any appreciation of the fact that this is something that has been taught generation after generation, literally going back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. The mothers and fathers in the deserts of Egypt and Israel taught this in the 2nd and 3rd century. Again, monks like the author of The Cloud of Unknowing taught it in the Middle Ages. And monks like Father Thomas and his associates were teaching it in the 1960s and 70s. It is a lifelong part of the Christian tradition, but it has been esoteric. It's been hidden. And so it just confounds me to no end, first of all, that people can so badly misread a parable. But then again, we were talking about this last night. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret almost any passage in the Bible. But then also that there is so much ignorance of Christianity's own history. So I'm just throwing that out there because in case you've ever heard any of that kind of stuff. Oh, and let me just say one other thing. You'll notice as I give you the instructions, I never tell you to empty your mind. Meditation is not about emptying our minds. Meditation is about holding our thoughts gently so that they gently come and gently go. Meditation is a posture of non-aggression towards our own hearts. That's all it is. And if we, in the gesture of meditation, if we taste silence, what a tremendous gift that is. And if you're like me, when I taste silence, usually not very long before I'm like, oh, I'm silent. Look, I finally got it. Yeah, oops. So the reality is that I think for so many of us, our tastes of silence are like hors d'oeuvres. Now, I do believe that we can, by grace, we can dive deep into silence. I've had a limited number of experiences like that. I'm sure many of you have too. But I also believe that even if you have more of that hors d'oeuvre experience of silence, the hors d'oeuvres are made of the same quality food as the big feast. So even those little glimpses of silence are a blessing. So I'm doing too much talking and we're not doing enough meditating. So let me give you the instructions. The first thing you need to do is choose a sacred word. It can be any word. Now, this is a little different from a mantra. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. But for example, if you become a part of the TM community, you will be given a mantra. And then you're expected to work with that mantra. There's no exchanges and refunds. With centering prayer, the cloud of unknowing never says, your abbot must assign you a mantra, and then once you have it, you're stuck with it. So the idea is that you don't have to use the same word all the time. Now, having said that, when you choose the word, stick with that word at least for today, or maybe at least for the next few months, or something like that. So generally speaking, it's, because what happens if you're in the middle of your prayer time and you're like, I don't like this word, now I want a different word, then what are you doing? You're thinking about words. So you choose a word. It does not have to be a pious word. It can be a churchy word. It can be a word like God or Jesus or Mary or whatever. It can also be maybe a more open-hearted word, love, joy, peace. I've tried words from other languages, but I got into trouble one time because there's an Irish word for silence, and it's toast. And you can imagine how that went. So if you choose a word from another language, choose one that can maybe doesn't carry too many associations. But the point is not even what the word means, because you're really going to let go of the word's meaning. The word is meant to be a symbol. And I'm going to read the words because it's specific here. A symbol of our intention to consent to the divine presence and action within us. So it's about intention and it's about consent. Now, you'll often hear that meditation is a practice of attention. And we talk a lot about that in the centering prayer world, that there's a distinction between attention and intention. And I don't mean to be dualistic here. There's nothing wrong with attention. But within the centering prayer instructions, the focus is on intention. So it's heart-centered. What is your heart showing up for? And it's this gesture of consent. It's this gesture of, I choose to make myself available to the divine presence and action within. And so that word becomes kind of the symbol of that. So that's guideline number one. So while I'm giving you the other 3 guidelines, kind of be thinking about what your word's going to be. Then guideline number 2 is to sit. Although, and people will say, well, what about walking the labyrinth? I'm like, yeah, you can walk the labyrinth too. These are suggestions. These aren't dogmas, Dogma is way overrated. But the suggestion is, if you want the sitting form, sit comfortably. Doesn't have to be a lotus position, but if you like lotus positions, please, by all means. But what I would suggest is find a way of holding the dignity of your body. This morning we had that beautiful exercise with the divine name inscribed in our body. So maybe keep that in mind as you find your posture. So obviously a posture that matters for you. You can experiment with having your spine straight, with feet flat on the floor. Your hands can be just resting in your lap. You can create a mudra, especially if you're familiar with working with mudras, or just whatever is gentle. The guidelines also recommend eyes closed. I've had enough training in shamatha over the years that I think eyes open or closed, again, whatever works for you. I can see challenges either way. So hold your eyes in a way that works for you. But keep that sense of the dignity of the body. This is an embodied practice. I am bringing my mind, my heart, my gut, my body into the presence that is already present. I am reminding myself of what is already there. So we settle in, and when I ring the chime, silently introduce your sacred word. And here's how it's different from a mantra. You do not have to repeat your sacred word. But the third guideline is whenever any kind of thought arises, you return to your sacred word. So if you start thinking about what's the latest new movie? I was watching the Avatar movie on the plane, so the new Avatar movie, or the cute movie about the little girl. Was it Are You There, God? It's Me, Mark. Whatever the new movie. If you're thinking about the new movie, that's actually, I assigned mail. I did not read that book growing up, but I'll tell you, that's a great movie because it's a very spiritual, deeply, deeply spiritual movie. And the girl figures out religion is a crock. So, spoiler alert. But so what you're thinking about the latest movie? You're thinking about, I'm going to be traveling to Ireland next month or whatever. Return to your sacred word. It's not if you have other thoughts. It's when you have other thoughts. I cannot stress this enough. Friends, having other thoughts is part of the practice. It is to be expected. If you have those thoughts, you have not broken centering prayer. It's like, oh, there the thought. I return to my sacred word. Now, if you're like me, you get so many thoughts, your sacred word functions like a mantra. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. Sometimes, and this I learned from a Buddhist friend, sometimes you forget the instructions. And what that means is you get a thought, and the thought is so juicy, you follow it from thought to thought to thought to thought to thought, and then 6 minutes in, you're like, wait a minute, what was that sacred word? That's your heart saying, go back. It's just an invitation. It's not a judgment. It's not a criticism. Just go back. When that tickles you, go back to your sacred word. And so that's the process. And if by grace you notice after the sacred word that little bit of silence, pay attention. Just notice the silence. And probably pretty soon along comes another word, a thought. Thomas Keating used to compare the thoughts of our consciousness, and thoughts can be daydreams, images, feelings, again, ideas, songs, stories, anything that kind of comes along. He compared them to boats on a river. And some boats are little dinghies, some boats are ocean liners, some boats are freighters. Speedboats come along and they're skiers. Some boats you want to get on the boat, fishing boats, a yacht. But the invitation is to let the boat go. Here comes the boat. I remember my sacred word, I let the boat go. And so here's the kicker. Between and beneath every thought and every recitation of the sacred word is vast, limitless, luminous, beautiful, loving silence. So it's a waltz. Thought, sacred word, silence. Thought, sacred word, silence. And this is the centering prayer practice. Now, the recommendation is 20 to 30 minutes twice a day. The book of Revelation talks about silence in heaven for half an hour. So I'm a bit of a purist, and I think, half an hour really is kind of the standard. But again, there's no dogma here, and we're just going to do 7 minutes. 7 minutes in heaven. Well, we are in heaven, so why not, And then this brings us to the fourth guideline, and the fourth guideline is that for however much time you choose. And again, before you get dogmatic about the time, remember the early monks did not have watches. They didn't have an Apple Watch to buzz at them. So it's not about how much time. There's a Zen Buddhist writer who, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but his book is called Each Moment is the Universe. Isn't that a great affirmation right there? Each moment is infinity. So you can do this for 2 seconds, and it is still an infinite gift. Truth is a pathless land. Doing it for a longer period doesn't get you any closer to it. But we do. We live in the temporal world, So today we're gonna do 7 minutes. If you do it on your own, 20 to 30, whatever, 10 if you're busy. Yeah. And then you'll have a chime. I'm a cyber contemplative. I use an app on my phone. But when that chime comes, and this is the fourth guideline, and I'll read it to you. At the end of your prayer period, remain in silence with your eyes closed or open for a couple more minutes. And we'll just do 1 minute. And I affectionately call this the bonus round. And I really like to emphasize this because it's, I visit a lot of centering prayer groups with my travels. And a lot of times people this is kind of the afterthought. It's the caboose on the train. I think it's really important. Think of it as the Sabbath day. The Sabbath after your centering prayer. So you have your time, you hear the chime, and then you rest. Just that gesture of rest. So we'll take 1 more minute, and then at the end of 8 minutes, we'll have a third chime. Okay? Are we willing to do this? Let's do this. There it is. And so I'm just going to read a little prayer to kind of set the mood, and then off we go. O Heavenly One, to fully know and receive and appreciate your divine presence in our lives. Guide us to love as you love. Show us how to see as you see. Teach us to forgive as you forgive. Inspire us to be creative as you are creative. Direct us to manifest delight and felicity and beatitude and joy as you manifest all these. And most of all, through your Spirit, may our hearts beat as your heart, our hearts beating as one. Amen. So, there was a monk in Conyers, Georgia, at the monastery that I have studied at. He just passed away in March. His name was Brother Elias Marischal, and the bookstore probably doesn't have his book because it's not widely known, but it's called Tears of an Innocent God. And I can give you the information later. I would encourage you to stock it because it's Elias. Before he became a Trappist monk, he was a TM teacher. So his work is very Theosophical Society friendly, kind of an East-West kind of a integration. But I knew him, of course, at the end of his life. He just died, like I said, a couple of months ago. And I remember, and this was before the pandemic, a few years ago, I was visiting him. And we were just talking, and he was one of these people that when he walks into a room, the room gets quieter. That's the kind of person he was. And so I said to Elias one time, boy, you've been between centering prayer and TM, you've been meditating for, and he's like, 50 or 60 years now. And I said, you must really experience silence well, don't you? And he just looked at me and he said, I am silence. I am silence. Now, I knew him. We were very good friends. And I knew that he had just as many boats on his river as you or I. So I tell that story not to put Elias on a pedestal. I tell that story to invite every one of us to reflect on the fact that we are silence too. And if Elias had a leg up on me or on you, it was just that he more readily noticed it. That's all. I could go in about 20 different directions, and I'm real conscious of the time. So what I think I'm going to do is tell 3 brief stories, and then we'll try to wrap it up and still have some time for conversation. And you will definitely know one of these stories. You will probably know the other one. And unless you've been reading my books, you won't know the third one, because the third one is my story. And so I'll begin with that one. I was 16 years old, so it was the winter of 1977. And I grew up in the Lutheran Church. My family, just typical post-World War II, white middle class, Americans. My dad was an Air Force pilot. My mom, stay-at-home mom. And we went to the Lutheran church, and, church was church. It was a place where I could kind of flirt with the girls, and not much beyond that. But I would go to these church weekend, events because, hey, all my friends went. So I went to one. It was in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. at an old Presbyterian conference center, and I was there and kind of not really into it, except for the flirting with the girls bit. It was church talk. Whatever. I was 16 years old. It's like, whatever, roll eyes, that kind of thing. But on Saturday night, they had a communion service. It's what you do at one of these weekend events. It was just high school Lutheran kids from all over the state of Virginia. So there was probably about 100 of us, that converged on this old Presbyterian conference center. And so it's 1977, so it's kumbaya, it's kind of folky. They'll know we are Christians by our love kind of stuff. It was all right. I had no expectation, no inclination, nothing in me desiring this. But in the middle of that communion service, the room was flooded with light. The room was flooded with light and love. I fell in love with everybody in the room. There wasn't an I to fall into love. We were love. We were light. Time stood still. When I think about it now, almost 50 years later, it feels like it lasted for 5 seconds, it lasted for a half an hour, it lasted for eternity. I think it was all of the above. However long it lasted, eventually it's like the lights turned. And God's honest truth, God is my witness, and YouTube as well. I honestly thought the room became more incandescent. I thought there was a physical shift in the room, that the room was flooded with a light without any source, the sourceless light. And love, likewise. The light and the love were indistinguishable. They were not two. The moment passes, the communion service ends, they're breaking everything down to set up a stereo. They've got 100 hormone-drenched teenagers in this room, so they were going to have a dance. I went up to a couple of my friends, and I said something like, "Wasn't that the most amazing thing ever?" Yeah. They looked at me and they were like, "Yeah, it was nice. Let's go get a Coke." I didn't go to the dance. I actually went back to my room. I was so rattled at that point. I am still integrating that experience. Recently I participated in a clinical trial in Atlanta, a government-sanctioned clinical trial involving LSD. The LSD experience was almost as powerful as that. It was almost as powerful as that. So that's my story. Let's go back about 20 years before my story. I've already mentioned this man named Thomas Merton. At this point, he had been a Trappist monk for about 16 years. And Trappist monks, even today, they don't just decide, "Oh, let's go to the drugstore, I need more toothpaste," and they hop in the car and they go. It is unusual for monks to leave the monastery. They have to have a reason. They got a doctor's appointment or whatever. Part of the culture of monasticism is stability, and that's this idea you stay put, because you're there to find and be found by God. You don't need to go gallivanting off to the drugstore. But sometimes there are good reasons, and in this case, Merton had a good reason. He was one of the teachers of the novices, the new monks at his monastery, and he was getting something printed. So he had to go to the print shop and look at proofs. So the monastery is about an hour south of Louisville, Kentucky. He gets a friend of the monastery to drive him into town. This is the 1950s. So it's before shopping malls and all that. They drop him off right there in downtown Louisville. It's still a bustling section of town, about 4 blocks from the river. He's at 4th Street and Walnut Street. And he writes about this in his journal the very next day. And he says, I turned the street corner and suddenly I fell in love with everybody. And and then he writes a little bit more, and he ends by saying, and I have no way of telling them that they were all shining like the sun. That they were all shining like the sun. Let's go back about 25 years before that. And there was a teacher named Yeshua Bar Joseph. Some of you may know him as Jesus of Nazareth. And he was a traveling healer, and he had a few close friends, a couple of dudes named Peter and James and John, and they decided to go up Mount Tabor and pray. So they did. They got to the top of the mountain. And the story as it was told is that then Jesus began to glow. And his glowing was so amazing, it looked brighter than any bleach could whiten a fabric. But wait, there's more. Then Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, appeared. And they started talking. But wait, there's more. Then the voice of the divine mystery itself said, "This is my beloved." They're walking down the mountain, and Jesus is saying to these guys, don't talk about this. Don't talk about this. Which is very interesting because when I started studying at Shalem in the early 1980s, one of the first things that I was instructed was that if you do serious contemplative work, you need to learn when to talk about it and when not to. There's something about this work that if we talk about it carelessly, it can frighten people, it can confuse people, it can cultivate resistance in people. I don't need to go down that rabbit hole any further, but there's something about the esoteric that there's a sacredness in holding it quiet. It's not because we're ashamed of it. It's not because we are better than other people. In fact, those are traps we can fall into. But I think it's back to speak only when your words are an improvement on silence. That's a clue to what this is all about. I'm conscious of time, and I want to open it up for some conversation. There's so much more to say. But Rabbi Rami ended with his beautiful words about how the mystics are the heart of the great wisdom traditions. I hope I'm paraphrasing you legitimately well. And so I just want to say a little something about this word mystic. Because it comes from a couple of Greek words, mystes and mueo. Mystes, M-Y-S-T-E-S. And a mystes was somebody who was initiated into a mystery religion, an initiatory experience. Christianity, once upon a time, was an initiatory mystery religion. Baptism was the initiation rite. And eating the Eucharist was only for those who had been through the initiation. Again, not because Christians were better than other people, that's a distortion. But because there was something about the invitation to feast on the flesh and blood of Christ, which is to feast on the flesh and blood of the divine, that requires an intimate community. So it requires some sort of boundaries. You mentioned boundaries. Religion is all about boundaries. And we've all been traumatized by how religion sets up boundaries that hurt people. And today, hurting trans people, hurting queer people, hurting women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a distortion. And it's not that boundaries are bad. but that boundaries are easily abused. That there is something about creating a sacred container that can be helpful. And I think that's what initiation implies. But I also believe, and maybe especially today, that the most important initiation is the initiation that happens in here. That is not conferred by any institution or any credentialing committee, etc. And again, that's not to say that there isn't a place for those kinds of things, but they're so easily abused. The other word is mueo, and I'm probably butchering it, so if you're a Greek scholar, my apologies. It's M-U-E-O. It is the same word that we get the word mute from. When they were putting the lavalier on me, and I said, oh, and he said, don't mess with your mute button. There's a mute button, of course, down here, because they handle that on the console. But we all know our TV remote has a mute button. You press the mute button, the TV shuts up. Isn't it helpful? Depending on who's on TV, So mysticism has something to do with initiation, something to do with a sacred container, something to do with muting, which I think a better word is silence. But then those words also contribute to a word that shows up over 30 times in the Christian scriptures, the Second Testament of the Bible. Mystery. Mystery, and I don't mean mystery in a Hardy Boys Nancy Drew sense. I mean mystery in the sense not of a puzzle to be solved, but of a reality that cannot be put into words. If you want to solve the mystery, you have to experience it for yourself. I cannot give you the mystery. I can try to write about it, and I will fail. I think the great mystics, Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, Teilhard, Merton Thurman, et cetera, they all tried to write about it, and they all more or less failed. We enter the mystery ourselves, person by person, heart by heart, breath by breath. The invitation is given to us anew every moment, because after all, each moment is the universe. So I just want to leave you with this thought. And again, I know ultimately this hour was devoted to Christianity, but the weekend is devoted to the world. That I do think that that's one of the ways in which these teachings resonate across traditions. That we are all invited into a profoundly sacred mystery that is already in our hearts. We are invited to recognize what is already there. We are invited to be initiated into it. And when we are, it will probably leave us speechless. Amen.
I know you called it a mystery, but I have a question for you.
Yes.
Is our challenge that we are looking for something that we don't know, but in reality, if we're God, and God, let's say we're a part of God, God knows everything. So within us, we should know everything too. So is our challenge that we're just pretending not to know our true essence?
I believe that we are all playing hide and seek with ourselves. I mentioned I am somebody who lives with anxiety. I think anxiety, I think addiction, I think things we do to harm ourselves and harm one another, injustice, oppression, privilege, all the things that cause suffering. We're gonna hear from Io this afternoon, and that the genius of Buddhism is its project for responding to suffering. At least that's how I understand it. You may have something else to say. But that all of those things are an elaborate game of hide and seek. And so I think when we, back to Krishnamurti, truth is a pathless land. I absolutely believe that. And I do believe that again and again and again, we experience spirituality as a journey. It's a paradox. It's not that one is true and one is false. It's that they're both true at the same time. We're taking a journey to where we already are. And the taking of the journey matters. And there can be tremendous joy and tremendous challenge, lessons to be learned, conflicts to be resolved, etc. Life is a journey. I was born 60-something years ago. By God's grace, I've got a few more spins around the sun. Some of us, I just lost an uncle a year or two ago in his 90s. I mean, but that's what happens. We're born and we die, and then life is everything that happens in between. We experience it as a journey, don't we? But then maybe from a God's eye point of view, it's more like a mandala. Especially if you start talking about other lives. I mean, I don't want, in the interest of time, I won't go there. But so yeah, we're playing hide and seek. We're trying to discover what doesn't need to be discovered.
Your comments on silence reminded me of something I heard years ago. A therapist was talking about when we do this inner work, if we are indiscriminate about who we share it with and how we share it, we're not honoring it, and we're somehow diluting it.
Yeah.
So that just you made me think of it.
Which is similar to some of the points I was making, and there is something delicious about sharing. I mean, like me getting up here and telling my story. It's back to what we talked about this morning. We are not our stories, and yet our stories are beautiful. There's something sacred about holding our stories, and there's something sacred about sharing them. And that's where this whole concept of discernment kicks in, But I do think that especially today, we live in such a performative culture. I mean, social media, Instagram, all of that I think learning a little bit of, holding it close to heart probably would help most of us. I know it would help me, so.
Carl, as we are trying to understand and discover that mystery within ourselves, how do we relate that to our charge of service and responsibility?
We breathe in and we breathe out. The sun rises and the sun sets. There is summer and there is winter. I can tell you, in the Christian contemplative world, this is an ongoing conversation. That what is the relationship between contemplation and action? If any of you are followers of Richard Rohr, who's kind of the big name in contemplative Christianity right now, his ministry is called the Center for Action and Contemplation. And Richard will tell you the most important word in that title is the word "and." The problem is that we can get into, okay, contemplation is more important than action, or action is more important than contemplation. I mean, I know a lot of people who are activists who think what I do is self-indulgent. But I think, and then I have one friend and she says, I'm too deep to bother paying my bills. She's joking, of course. But it shows how the contemplative can go off the rails too. So I think if we can hold contemplation and service as the rhythm of the breath, we breathe in silence, we breathe in love, we allow ourselves to bask in that light, whether we perceive it or not. And then we breathe out, we share it with one another. We work to make the world a better place. We work to repair the world. We work to fight injustice, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to visit those imprisoned. All the stuff that Jesus said, do, and to do it to Jesus, so that it's not your ego, in charge. it's holy. The thing, you get deeper and deeper into the mystical life, you keep bumping into paradox. So just get used to it. And the thing is, what was the old saying? When you find a fork in the road, take it. When you find a paradox in the mystical life, embrace it. Embrace it and step right into that paradox and hold both of them. The book I'm writing right now, the book I'm writing right now, is probably be published in 2025, is tentatively titled How to Read the Bible Like a Mystic. And I can tell you, one of the themes of the book will be learning to read the Bible paradoxically. That I think so much of the problem with how Scripture gets interpreted, at least in a Christian context, is that people interpret it in a very linear one way. We've got to learn to hold paradoxical consciousness. And that's with our Scripture study, but really every aspect of life.